welcome everyone and thank you for staying. Everyone who's here is supposed to be here. What was the incentive in creating these projects? And if we could start, Jeff?
I mean, I did it as part of like Inside Out Film Festival, but my kind of personal question, I suppose, is like I was really interested in looking into, I feel like in the context of like Toronto, we often like name native land and like have this kind of like we need to acknowledge the native land, and that seems to be the extent of how we engage with that often. And so I was really interested in like what my relationship is acknowledging kind of my great-grandparents that have come over in different ways, and so trying to kind of really look deeper. And so at first I thought that I was just gonna like try and like, you know, use that more kind of a naming strategy, but it really ended up being a conversation with my grandmother about kind of what histories have brought to this land and how do we then move from that and acknowledge, because I think that especially in like upper class communities and white communities, there's a really complete ignorance about being able to even start to understand the complexity and depth of that history. So that's really what I was looking at in my films.
Well, the piece Assumptions that was shown here is actually one of 5 pieces that go together in a project that I did called Stories from the Inner City. And I was originally a teacher in Regent Park, which is the oldest public housing community in Canada. And one of the things I was really struck by when I was teaching there was that many of the majority of the stories that you heard from about the community were told by people from outside it who really didn't know very much about it and who tended to tell very negative stories. So you see one in the context that you saw here that is a negative story, but there also are others on that. It's negative and positive, I think, and there are others within this project that are very positive stories. So that project came out of wanting to look at that and wanting to work with young people in the community. And there were sort of 2 parts to the project. One was I got a grant from the Ontario Arts Council, and part of it was that I was showing them how to create digital storytelling pieces themselves, and then they were then going and working with other young people within the community that they knew and worked with, and then also that we were creating this particular piece. So there were sort of 2 things to it.
Okay, hi. So in terms of, what was the question?
What was the incentive in creating the project?
Okay, so it was for the master's program at Robertson. So it was my thesis film. In terms of like the subject matter, why I decided to look at that, it's because I wanted to look at the way media represents Africa as a continent and the people that come from that continent. And as a young African Canadian growing up here, I struggled with the images that I saw on the news. And for a long time, I took what I saw to be the truth and to be facts. And then as I got older, I realized that the media is also telling a story in the same way that we would tell stories with each other. So I wanted to look at how people and individuals are represented by Western news media, and to look at how it affects young people who fit my demographic growing up, and to see how young artists are using their art to respond and to challenge some of these depictions, and that's kind of where that idea came from.
One intersecting theme in all of your work seems to be the idea of constructing a counter-narrative, because you all work with dismantling dominant narratives. Like in your film, you see this hyper-industrialization. We don't look at what's lost, what's buried, and the creation of that. And in your film, the criminalization of people in Regent Park, and then the really broad, complex issue of how the continent is repeatedly misrepresented. I was wondering if you could speak on the idea of constructing counter-narratives as it pertains to storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just reading a book by Thomas King, and he says that stories are all that we are, and so it's the stories that we choose to tell that kind of that we leave with the world. And I think that I've noticed that, like, you know, there's a lot of stories about kind of oppression and about like being disadvantaged or marginalized, but like really having honest emotional narratives about what it means to come from places that have enacted privilege, and that privilege has enacted like huge amounts of violence. Having that conversation is something that narrative is something that I don't even know how to I haven't heard a lot of. So it was my attempt to like start that conversation with my ancestry, because I feel like there's all these things that, you know, with your grandparents, these things you can't really say that are really underlying the ways that we've gotten here. So yeah, but I think the counter narratives are powerful. So
I agree with what you're saying, and I think for me, like, I mean, I didn't grow up in Regent Park. I grew up in North York in Toronto, and I found it really surprising when I first started to work in that community, and I've worked, you know, in various ways. Like, I've been an educator there, but I've also done a lot of work as an artist and as an advocate in the community, that people that maybe didn't know people from Regent would make assumptions and stereotypes about what the people that I loved and knew really well were like, and I found that really hard, kind of heartbreaking. And I just felt like if there was an opportunity for those stories to be told, for people to hear those voices and to see that was a way of starting to open conversation and starting to have a larger sense of defining what Canada and Toronto is on a larger scale, that I think should be deeper, and that's sort of where I'm coming from with it.
And I think that I kind of touched on this idea of, you know, telling your own story and talking to young artists who are practicing their art, but I never saw them on the screen, and so I had to go out to seek the kinds of material that you saw in the film, and because how often do you see young Black youth on TV in a positive light? So that's kind of where that came from, and I wanted to use an independent form of filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, to showcase this, and I wanted to talk to them and just see how were they affected by this main narrative or story that is the news, and also their own family stories. How did they balance the different stories in their life, and what kind of stories are they creating for themselves? So that's, I guess, the film itself is a form of speaking back and creating our own narrative within this kind of main.
Very true.
Yeah.
And in both your films, I see a sense of the juxtaposition between peace and violence. It's very overt in your film because you talk about
the words.
Peace and violence. And it made me think about how there's a colonial legacy within the way the city has been built, and your film excavates that. And within your film, because of what happens to the character, you get a sense that with the community work that's built, with the spirit of collaboration, that can always be disrupted when outside forces come in and they can arrest people without proof and engage in police brutality.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could speak on how peace and violence are negotiated within the film and within your larger experiences.
Sure.
Well, I think that my piece is really a documentary piece as well, right? So I could speak to that in terms of Peter's response to what happened, because I think that that's been incredibly important. And I think you get a sense from the film of who he is. And I mean, you're hearing his voice, and he wrote the story, right? And we worked together to create what the images are that you see. And I was actually there within 15 minutes of that incident happening. Like, he went in the house and called me, and I came down. I've known him since he was 8. And even on that day, I was incredibly impressed by his response to it. And I was really upset. This is a young man that I really think of as part of my family, and I was really just so devastated by something like that happening, literally like right outside his house at 6 o'clock in the evening. And he said to me on the day, you know, sometimes these things happen for a reason, and I have to figure out what my reason is. And and I think he absolutely has. You know, he's gone off to do his master's degree. He's out at, just graduated actually in May at from UBC, and he's very involved in doing social justice work, and is actually using a lot of this kind of media-based, arts-based work in doing that and exploring that. And he says in the film that he was working on a piece about systemic racism within the police, and he's pursued that and has a book that he's working on that has to do with that. So I think that you're seeing like that juxtaposition right in his own response, right? I mean, there are lots of other people that have these horrible negative experiences that don't respond in a positive way, and I think that when these things happen, we do have a choice how we respond to it, and the response can be something that in the end becomes positive, or it can be something that can injure that person themselves or other people. And so I think in this instance, that's something that I think is a very positive thing.
Yeah, I grew up in the suburbs in this kind of like masquerade of peace, I feel like, this kind of like uneasy peace. And I think that, you know, the foundations of this country are violence, and I think then when you have money or when you have like the resources, you build these spaces of peace that kind of like, but they're not real. And there's a lot that silence, there's a lot that is kind of underlying that sort of like happy family kind of thing. And so it's how, and then violence is kind of shed onto, you know, other communities, Regent Park, these places. And so it's finding that, I think peace and violence exists within each of us in different ways, and so it's finding ways to bring to tell narratives that have that complexity as opposed to kind of like easy ones, I think. So yeah.
With your films, what was the reaction when you showed them within specific communities? Yeah, starting with you.
As well, the response I get overwhelmingly is either surprise and disbelief, or yep, of course that's what happens. There's very few people that have a response in between those two things, which for me is sort of the point of making a film like that, because I think that what you want to do is open the conversation and you know, get people who maybe haven't had that experience, number one, or who find that difficult to want to see, to start to think about it and to start to see it and to have conversations about it. And so yeah, those are fundamentally the responses, basically.
Have you found that you've gotten a different reaction when you've screened it outside those communities in comparison to?
Well, yes. If I'm if I'm in Regent Park, people are like, yeah, of course that happened. Like most people in that community. Certainly if you're a young black man, you've probably had, if not that extreme an experience, something similar to that happened to you. And pretty much anyone that I know that lives in that community would not be surprised by hearing that story at all. If I'm in a situation where there's a screening where it's in a different context, maybe a more middle class context, people are certainly more surprised to hear that, and I think shaken by the idea that the police could do something like that. That's okay. It's okay to be shaken sometimes, you know? Yeah, hopefully that leads to questions and to people being more engaged in a conversation about why that is and how do we change that.
Are you asking me
Yes.
the same question? Okay. Sorry, I'm like half here. Well, I recently finished the film. At the end of June is when I just put it up online, and so I think yours is, how old is the film?
It's a little over a year old.
Okay, so I think with mine, it just hasn't really, I haven't had the opportunity to show a lot of people yet, but in terms of just even the online community, I seem to be getting positive feedback from, you know, members of the diaspora in terms of trying to or creating works that help change the image of the way we see the continent portrayed in the media. So I think that, and also the film's going to be at Regent Park early November. So I think it's just at its beginning stages, but it is available online in full form. But I don't actually have, I haven't gotten a lot of feedback from people yet. So.
And because you had so many subjects in your film, how did you balance your perspective and what you wanted to place emphasis on with all these different ideas and different forms of art?
I don't know. I actually have no idea, because I wanted to cover all of these different issues, and I couldn't just pick one because they were all connected. The issue of mainstream media representations of Africa, and then looking at how first, second generation immigrant youth experience in Canada. How do those two ideas relate? Well, in my own experience, I was affected by the mainstream media depictions of Africa. I was affected by what I saw on the news, and that affected how I saw myself, how I saw Africa, and how I saw other people, my parents and people who came from the continent. So, I had to, all of those issues had to come up because they were just, it was too complex. I couldn't just pick one and say I'm going to focus on that, because eventually the next thing would come up as well. So I don't know if I found a balance. I was trying to cram a lot in a short doc, but yeah, I don't know.
I think the balance is there. Yeah, it's very nuanced. And with your film, what sort of conversations have arisen from showing it? Specifically, I think your film serves as a really good starting point for having these conversations across generations. Yeah. I was wondering, with directing it towards the character of the grandmother, were you thinking about your real grandmother?
Yeah, I think that like I said, there's these conversations that, my grandmother's kind of 80 years old or something now, and the way that I see and I've had to do kind of my own discovery of this, but these things like colonialism, or these things like the theft of indigenous land, are foundational in my understanding of how I'm going to move forward from my life, and those are things that I never have had conversations around and within my family. And so but that's a difficult question to figure out. How do you talk to your grandmother about something like this, because there's very systemic reasons why these things have been ignored for generations. And so this to me was almost like, and it's not like she's never seen the film, probably never will, but I figured it was me imagining a conversation, and I think that's the possibility of that conversation then opened me up to the direction that I wanted to move in, because I realized that oftentimes the real emotions behind, my grandmother's not necessarily an evil person, but the acts that have come with, building a home in this country have brought violence and evil to other people. And so, it's just kind of, and so it's definitely a conversation I'm still having with myself to figure out then how do we kind of proceed from here. But I think also just in general, it's a conversation that communities that need to be having that conversation aren't, or when it's done, it's in a very I'm going to name the native land that I'm on, and then that's check mark, done, moving on, and then you're not actually investing kind of your emotions and the depth of the history that other people are having to deal with. It's more just tokenizing. So yeah, I think that there's, I look at it now, it's been 6 or 7 months now, and I'm maybe more, and I'm I don't like watching it at all or anything, but I think that it definitely brought me somewhere, asking that question and then figuring out what kind of came out in a spoken word piece.
So she hasn't seen it?
No, none of my mom, those are the people who I actually would probably have the conversations with, but I don't want to, I'm not ready to go there. But,
And how do these films work within your overall canon as artists? Are you emergent filmmakers? Have you made a lot of different productions? What are the productions that you hope to do as an extension of this work?
Yes. Okay. So that was my first film. So, and I don't have a film background, and I did it for the program. But I am definitely interested in documentary filmmaking and exploring that further. And I am hoping to have I have a couple projects that I'm working on, but they take forever. So I don't know. We'll see.
I would describe myself as a multidisciplinary artist. So I initially started off in theater, and I do work as a filmmaker, and I do photography as well. And I would say, really, if I had to say what was the commonality in the work that I do, is that a lot of it has to do with social justice issues. And I really am interested in working collaboratively with people whose stories we often don't hear in the mainstream. So, yeah, this is a project that I finished about a little over a year ago, and I directed a play that toured across Canada last summer that is a one-man show written by someone that I've worked with collaboratively quite a lot named Victor Gomez. He actually graduated from the master's program here in Fine Arts last year. And that piece, that one-man show is looking at kind of the roots of violence and where violence comes from. And I have another multidisciplinary project that I'm in development with right now.
And has your film been screened in schools?
Yeah. Okay. So as I said, the project is one of 5 different stories. So that's one that's specifically looking at policing, but there are a couple that are coming to Canada stories. There's one that's about a young woman whose father had a stroke when she was 12, and how she sort of became the parent in that moment because her parents didn't speak English and she had all this responsibility suddenly. There's another one about interracial dating. So they're actually being used. We have a distributor for the project, and they're being used in schools quite a lot.
Yeah, that's really good to know.
I'm not a huge, this is the first film I made, except for grade 10 French projects and stuff, but I'm not sure, writing is where my passion is and telling stories, so this was, I think, a good, doing the film made me tell a story, and that was nice, but I don't think I necessarily will, center my work. The cameras confuse me, I don't know. But,
It's beautifully shot.
Did you shoot it yourself?
Yeah, I had a friend who's a film student help me out, but I had a day with a nice camera, and just kind of went around and shot things. So.
Okay. And what sort of spaces has your film been screened in thus far? I think you had a screening at U of T?
Yeah. So U of T, and the event was related to the African diaspora, and I think the theme was about reclaiming your past, and there were some people did spoken word there, and a few people just talked about their experience as a member of the diaspora and as a young immigrant, or coming from a family of immigrants. So there was that, and then pretty much here, and then
Regent Park Film Festival.
Regent next, yeah. So.
Yeah. And my film opened at Regent Park Film Festival last year. Mm-hmm. So, and actually, does your film come from them to here as well? It's a partnership, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. This event was presented with the Regent Park Festival.
Yeah.
Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, well, I can speak on, because I studied Laura Mulvey and the gaze theory and this idea of being attracted to the subject on screen. I was using that even in my own project, but I was using it through a post-colonial lens, and this idea of the other, and how the other is in a way it's attractive, but it's still different. So I was definitely using that in my research, and we're looking at the space, and there's black people, but then we look at black youth, and I feel like they're even more marginalized in a way, because youth in general, we don't see enough of their stories up there, but then you go and you make them from a visible minority group, and they're even more marginalized. So I was definitely challenging Western news media, which is, we live in the West, so that's all we're exposed to. If we were, in somewhere in Senegal, you might be seeing something different on screen, and the way they engage with it might be different. But living in the West, that's all I'm exposed to. So looking at space and black youth being shut out from that space, and these ideas of black and white representation. So maybe seeing black people on screen as criminals or as victims, maybe that is attractive, and when I say Western audience, I mean we're all Western audience, we live in the West. So, you know, seeing the black subject on the screen, it is attractive to see, you know, Kei-san was saying in the film that, I watched the film a million times, but he was saying that, you know, that we weren't going to see a young black artist, but if we saw a violent criminal on the news who happened to be black, that was way more interesting to us as audiences. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I was definitely considering the different spaces and who was allowed in the space and how people were represented. So I definitely did use these theories. I didn't really go as in depth into it as you're going, but yeah.
Yeah, so I guess most of my kind of like work outside of school right now is with Asian Arts Freedom School, and we do like workshops looking at kind of diasporic history and telling stories that we have always carried with us but never necessarily had the space to tell. So I think that in political activism or whatever we want to call that, there's often a privileging of like direct action or like raw I'm angry kind of thing, and I think that art and like looking at personal healing and the story and how our stories are actually mediating the work that we do on a perhaps more visible scale are really important, that those both are held together, because I think that they each have value. And the other part of your question, the audiences, I mean, I did the film I did for a queer film festival, and I think that part of that was an intentional narrative. I knew it was going to be a whole bunch of, like, the Inside Out Film Festival is a bunch of like old gay white guys, middle class, upper middle class kind of think we're going to see it, and so I'm like, how do I knew I could tell a story about like complex Japanese dice, but that was like, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to like figure out what would I share in common with them that I could speak to that would actually kind of shift the politics of how we're talking about queer identity, because it's not about queerness per se, but to me it's fundamentally about myself, which is, you know, whatever. So yeah, but I think that there's the role of art is like the worlds that we've been given are like really restraining in how we can see ourselves, and it's actually this whole like, are you an artist, are you not, like, to me that's not a question, it's like what do we need to imagine, because each of us need to imagine things, and it's not about whether it looks good on film or whether it, like, you know, that's what the world will tell us it's about, but it's actually about like how can we find ways to like give justice to like what we've experienced. So
I like that question a lot. I was just sitting here thinking that I come from a family that are actually quite involved in politics, as in like the politics of the nation or the province. And I get asked all the time, you know, are you involved in politics as well? And I'm not in the same way. I think that the work that I do is very grassroots. And I think that, but I would still say that, yes, I am involved in politics, but it's through the art that I do, and it's through the work that I do with youth. Like when I did my master's, I was looking at how social justice and being like literate citizens and the arts kind of can come together, and how if young people are not able to tell their own stories, if they don't have the tools to do that, we're really doing ourselves as a nation and them as individuals a disservice. And we really want everyone in our society to be able to speak for themselves, right? And to speak about things of importance to them, so that we can engage in dialogue on a larger scale. So yes, I think that I am involved in political action, but it's maybe not, well, maybe it is what you're asking, I'm not quite sure. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
And I would pretty much agree with Sheena, right? In that I don't consider myself a political activist, I'm not involved in that. But I think whether you're a writer or a filmmaker, even creating works that ask questions that we may not necessarily want to talk about, that is a form of activism. And something I'm definitely interested in, and looking at, you know, who represents us in society, who represents us and why. And this idea of how powerful storytelling is, and how it's, you know, one person's voice, if it's powerful enough, can create the narrative, and through history it becomes facts, because their voice was just powerful enough. And I think more works are created, more artists, like the artists in my film and you guys as artists, more people telling their stories, I think will kind of shift the platform and change things. So.
One of the things that I'm really interested in as someone who grew up in Canada is that when I look at people who come here as refugees from other countries, often the first people to come, like the first wave, are people who are artists in those countries, because they're the ones that are sort of the canary in the coal mine, and they're sounding the alarm about what they see happening. So as an example, a person I was speaking about who I have collaborated with quite a bit professionally, who came from Colombia, and came about 10 years ago at a point in time politically there where he spoke out against the government and his life was threatened, so he came here. And I think that, you know, it's an interesting thing, like as Canadians, because there are many things that we need to look at in our own society, but we don't often understand that that as artists that can be a really important thing. Like I think that that's something, there's a growing awareness of that's starting to happen that I think is exciting within the arts community. So yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I'm not sure that when I was making it, I was thinking about the mainstream audience and thinking about changing their perception. I think the quote at the beginning of the film is, if you don't like someone's story, write your own, which is by a well-known African novelist. So I think that the reason I did that film is in a way to talk to young Black members of the diaspora, or not even of the African continent, but you know, maybe they came from China, maybe they came from South America, wherever. Being immigrant youth, first and second generation immigrant youth, I wanted to look at this idea of storytelling, and in a way to say that we would like to see more works like that out there. Because once you do that, you are changing the perception, you are changing the representation and the images that we're exposed to constantly. So I think that when I was making it, I was imagining an audience that looked like me. So.
You go ahead.
I think mine was for myself. Like I really needed to do this. The film was a lot of mental work more than it was anything else, and I don't know, like when I write something I feel like is really important to me, it's something that I know is pointing in a direction and like is pointing towards a future and are things that I need to hear constantly as advice. So this was really something that was for that. And if other people see it and feel something, that's cool, but for myself mostly.
I feel like it's being seen in some of the places I'd like it to be, because I know it's being used in schools, so I know that there are conversations that are coming from that. The mischief in me would love to, you know, go and sit down with Rob Ford and Peter and have a conversation afterwards. I think we do pretty well with him. Yeah, I mean, I know that Peter's using it a lot in the work that he's doing at UBC, in some of the coursework that he's doing there, and there have been a lot of conversations opened there, because Vancouver it was very interesting to see that last film, actually, because Vancouver, in terms of even their awareness of some of these issues, are in a very different place than we are even in Toronto. So he's found that to be really interesting and challenging in different ways there. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, so
sorry, we can take the conversation up to having a closing party on the second floor of the same building. Free food, cheap drinks, and Jeff will be performing.